Our topic this evening, who was Abraham? I was sort of surprised that we have never really done a full deep dive lecture on Abraham, who is such an important biblical figure, but also such an important figure in the religions that are called after his name, the Abrahamic religions. So for example, the Kaaba, which literally means cube, the Kaaba of Mecca. It's a stone building at the center of a mosque in Mecca, where pilgrims make the conclusion of the Hajj, the great pilgrimage that is one of Islam's 5 pillars. In other words, something that Muslims ought to try to do at least once in their life if they can. The Kaaba also marks the direction to which Muslims face 5 times each day when offering prayers. The modern building, it's been destroyed many, many times in history. The modern building is a reconstruction that included massive structural replacements that happened as recently as 1996, having been an update of an Ottoman era rebuilding that had happened centuries earlier, and so on. So during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, there was an earlier Kaaba, and that was seen by the local Arab community as a holy shrine. And in it, multiple traditional gods of the Arabs were worshipped, including one named Hubal, whose name is thought to derive from the Baal or Lord, a god in the pantheon of the Canaanites. And the shrine was also said to house 360 statues where different gods venerated, and the number there seems to be pretty telling. So maybe it's related to the calendar, where there is a god assigned to each day of a local solar year calendar. So Islamic tradition, anyway, believes that polytheism, that worship of multiple gods, that filling of the Kaaba with idols is a later degradation, because again, traditional legend had that long before, one of the rebuildings had been by Prophet Ibrahim, which is the Muslim understanding or name for Abraham, and his son Ismael, again the Muslim name for Ishmael, and it had been at that time anyway a place to worship the one God, Allah. Islamic tradition then identifies Arab peoples as descendants of Abraham via his eldest son Ishmael, giving him a very prominent role in the religion. And this is an inheritance that Islam has from stories that are found also in the Hebrew Bible. Of course, in Jewish tradition, Abraham is also understood to be the ancestor of the Jewish people via Isaac, his son by his wife Sarah, and then Isaac's son Jacob, who is the eponymous ancestor of Israel, since his name is both Jacob and Israel. And then of his 12 sons, one of them is Judah, the eponymous ancestor of the Judeans, which is where we get our name Jewish and Jew. Okay, and since Christianity, like Rabbinic Judaism, is one of the heirs of Second Temple Judaism, all 3 of these religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, along with other groups like the Samaritans, are called Abrahamic religions because of this common traditional understanding. If we just look at kind of a very simplified chart of these religions, beginning with Judaism of the First Temple, before the Temple of Solomon is destroyed by the Babylonians, after the exiles return from Babylon in the Persian period and rebuild a temple, that becomes Second Temple Judaism, which lasts all the way down until the Romans destroy the Second Temple. The Samaritans also emerge as an heir during the Second Temple period of First Temple Judaism, as they go into schism from other Second Temple Jews and maintain their own traditions, their own Torah, their own temple in the northern heartland, Mount Gerizim. And we also mentioned that since the Second Temple Jewish religion is beginning or is refounding itself within the Persian period. There also seems to be significant influence from the religion of the Persian Empire, Zoroastrianism, which is seen as either one of the original or monotheist or maybe duotheist religions. Like I say, one of the principal errors of Second Temple Judaism after the destruction of the temple and the regrouping of the religion by the rabbis instead of being led by priests who are making sacrifices is Rabbinic Judaism, of which almost all Judaism today is descended, whether it's Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, and the other types, so forth. They all are part of Rabbinic Judaism. The other principal error being Christianity, that also was significantly influenced by Greek paganism, or more specifically Hellenism in general, but especially Greek philosophical ideas. That also was influencing Second Temple Judaism the entire time, but in some ways Rabbinic Judaism pushed back more on it than Christians, who tended to embrace the Greek inheritance much more fully. Early Christianity's one of the principal errors is the imperial religion of the Roman Empire, which ultimately became split into Eastern Greek Christianity and Western Latin Christianity, among other errors like the traditions of African Christianity and also further East Christianity, the churches of the East. One of the diverse communities within early Christianity that eventually went extinct is the Christians who continued to follow Mosaic law. And it seems to be this branch of Christianity that influenced early Islam, with its major components being the Sunnis and the Shiites, although again, there are multiple more traditions than all of the ones that I'm having here in this very, very simplified diagram. And so with all of these religions looking back to Abraham and seeing Abraham a little differently, we could have an entire lecture on how Abraham is seen and how Abraham is understood in later sources. So how do the rabbis talk about Abraham? How is Abraham understood in Christianity, both East and West? How is he talked about in the New Testament, the Christian scripture? How is he talked about in the literature of the rabbis? How is he talked about in both the Quran and all of the hadith of Islam, the sayings associated and teachings associated with the Prophet Muhammad? And so that will have to come in a very different lecture, but what I want to look at instead is what can we say about Abraham and the character all the way up to the tradition as we have it in the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible. So Abraham is one of the first major characters. Actually, he's the first major character in Genesis. So the stories of creation, the Eden story, Adam and Eve, then the Cain and Abel story, and some other traditions associated with Cain, Noah and the flood story. These are all pretty brief stories where the characters more or less only have one or two very brief stories attached to them. Suddenly we get to Abraham and there are lots and lots of stories, and he becomes therefore a first major figure. Abraham, we've done recently a story on Moses and the Exodus, and how the Exodus is one of the two origin stories or origin myths for the Israelites. And so the idea when you're trying to say as a people who you are, where did you come from? The options tend to be you either as a people you always were here, you have been there as long as the stones, and maybe you emerged out of the rocks or something like that, or you came from somewhere else. And there are two we came from somewhere else stories competing in Genesis and Exodus. So one is everybody came from Egypt and led through the wilderness and came into the land of Canaan, led by Moses, and then his successor Joshua. And another one is Abraham, as the progenitor, came from Ur of the Chaldees. He's told by God to leave. He goes first to Haran in northern Mesopotamia and then makes it into the land of Canaan, which becomes again another origin story. Where did we come from? We came from Ur via the northern Mesopotamia, i.e., following along the Fertile Crescent here. So Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 has a document that is sort of famous for these begets, where saying so and so lived a certain amount of time and he beget him and her and so forth, or actually all hymns. This is thought by many scholars to be a separate, discrete book, like a Mesopotamian king list, the Sumerian king lists, where a document that's talking about all of the early patriarchs, above whom very few actually have stories in Genesis. So Adam has a story, Noah, and then Abraham, and the others really just have a couple of words that's associated with them, like Enoch and Peleg. And so when you look at the book of generations, it's split in Genesis into two parts in order to go from Adam to the Noah story, and then from Noah to the Abraham stories. And this is one of the first places that Abraham then appears. He's in this particular book of generations. He's seen as a vital originating patriarch, and we need to bring him from all of the antediluvian mythic patriarchs down past the flood to the first one who is seen as the general progenitor. So what are the sort of sources that we have outside of Abraham, outside the Bible? So some scholars have tried to connect Abraham based on his name. And so if you go back, further back into the time period when maybe Abraham would have lived. So this map is dated to the 18th century BC and is showing the various Amorite states and kingdoms that existed. And so there are names that people have found, for example, in the kingdom of Mari, where there's somebody, a figure there named Abram, which sounds a little like Abraham or Abram. And same thing, a Amorite king of Babylon has a name like Sumu Abum. The problem with all of these is that because just the B in Abraham is related to this Semitic word for father, there's all sorts of names that have a little bit of that in it, and so these are not particularly convincing. Like we haven't really found Abraham, we haven't found any of the stories. We've found that there are figures in Semitic kingdoms that have names that have components that include, this B and this M, and maybe that is somehow related. It's not very particularly convincing in that case. The ancient Egyptian records have also been scoured to find potential references to Abraham. So, for example, there's a stele of Seti I at Beit Shean in Canaan, in Galilee, that mentions a local Canaanite tribe that's called the Raham. And so an Italian historian, Mario Laverani, has speculated, well, if they themselves thought of themselves as having a progenitor, he would be the Abu Raham, in other words, the father of the Raham, which could get us to a name that sounds like Abraham. But that name is itself not attested. We just have the Raham attested. So this is a completely kind of a hypothetical anonymous ancestor, so again, not particularly convincing. There is an inscription from another pharaoh, Shoshank I, from the 10th century, that mentions a town in the Negev, in the desert, in the southern part of Canaan, called the fortress of Ibirama. And so again, there's a possibility here with the B and the R and the M that we have some kind of an existence of an Abraham tradition in the region as early as the 10th century, and that's possible. But again, it's not finding anything in terms of stories or anything closer to that for Abraham or any historicity. So really, apart then from these speculative connections on Abraham's name, we don't really have any traces of the character outside the Bible. So let's look at the Bible. So we did a lecture, when did the Torah become authoritative? So when we look at the 5 books attributed to Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we concluded that based on looking at all of the other books of the Bible, that the Torah really only became authoritative or well-read or and really important quite late in the Maccabean or Hasmonean period, that is to say, during the sort of short-lived independent Judean kingdom in the Second Temple period. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the text weren't around. It's just that they weren't maybe as widely circulated and important, although it could mean that they have a later date than sometimes. So people argue the date of the composition. But what we can definitely say is that although stories set in Genesis, they are meant to be set in a very distant past, in some cases, essentially the mythic past, the once upon a time kind of setting of the antediluvian period, and thus come first chronologically, they're not the first biblical text to have been composed. So the Pentateuch took its final form during the Second Temple period, but it also may include source texts that date from the exilic and pre-exilic, the First Temple period, and that's also true for Psalms, for the Deuteronomic histories, in other words, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And it's actually also true for prophetic books, which continued to be edited and added to. But parts of the prophetic books are traceable to prophets who are active in the First Temple period, and so they become some of our earliest biblical voices. And again, nobody who is writing a book, any one of these books that become the Hebrew Bible, that become the Christian Old Testament, nobody is writing that book with the idea that their little book is going to get compiled into a big thing that's going to be a Bible. That's something that happens later. So these are all distinct texts, and therefore they can be looked at to see what they know about, for example, characters in Genesis. And so while some of the characters in Genesis, like Adam and Eve, we did a whole lecture on the Eden story, they're not referenced by the First Temple prophetic writers, and they therefore may have been unknown to them. Abraham is more like Moses in that he is a figure that there is a seemingly long tradition about. And so he's mentioned by prophets including Isaiah, Micah, and Jeremiah, who were alive and operating in the pre-exilic time, the First Temple period, Jeremiah into the exile times, and then he's also mentioned by Ezekiel, who's writing at the time of the exile, so between the First and Second Temple periods. So if we go to Isaiah, in its present form, the book of Isaiah includes poems that are thought to have been written by the original prophet Isaiah, who was active perhaps in the 8th century BC. And then to those poems, which are spread around in chapters 1 to 39 of the present book of Isaiah, in addition to those, there are prose editions, and those prose editions are thought to date sometime to the end of the 7th century, the time of King Josiah, that is to say, the very end of the First Temple period. And that component then, scholars call Proto-Isaiah. Chapters 40 to 55 were added in the 6th century BC by an anonymous author during the exile, so between the periods. Deutero-Isaiah is what these are called. And then finally, chapters 56 through 66 are post-exilic, written in the Persian period, added by a Second Temple author that scholars call Trito-Isaiah, or maybe multiple Trito-Isaiah authors. So Abraham is referenced by all three, but of course it's the proto-Isaiah reference that's the earliest and the most important for our attempt to find out how early this tradition is. So in Isaiah chapter 29, there is a general poetic lament for the city of David. And so it begins, "Woe to you, Ariel, Ariel, the city where David settled." And then as that poem continues on, there's a reference to Abraham that is a prose insertion towards the end. And so that insertion says, "Therefore, this is what the Lord who redeemed Abraham says to the descendants of Jacob." And so after that insertion, the poem then continues on with words of insurance. And those go, "No longer will Jacob be ashamed. No longer will their faces grow pale." In other words, all of the Israelites, Jacob is seen as this eponymous ancestor, and so it's used as a poetically here to mean all of the people. So, "No longer will their faces grow pale. When they see among them their children, the work of my hands, they will keep my holy name. They will acknowledge the holiness of the Holy One of Jacob and will stand in awe of the God of Israel." So the original prophet then is using the names Jacob and Israel as a shorthand for the whole Israelite population, for whom Israel and Jacob are eponymous ancestors. And it's the prose insertion here that connects Jacob's descendants to Abraham. And so the author here, writing probably around the time of Josiah, is also mentioning Abraham as an important progenitor along with Jacob. The author of that prose edition presumes that the audience is already familiar with the name Abraham and some story in which the Lord redeemed him. And so that's all the shorthand that gets inserted. It doesn't say. So then if we go to the next section of Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, written again during the exile between the two temple periods, the author of this section also connects Abraham with Jacob as a progenitor of the people. So in Isaiah 41, we read, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend, I took you from the ends of the earth, and from its farthest corners I called you." So again, we have here Abraham connected to Jacob as a progenitor, and in this case, maybe there's also a familiarity with a tradition that Abraham is coming from a different place. In other words, you were brought to the land of Canaan, from a different place based on this calling that Abraham had. There's a second reference to Abraham in Deutero-Isaiah that illustrates the author is familiar with some of the Abraham tradition as we know it from Genesis. So in chapter 51 of Isaiah, we read, "Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness and who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were cut and the quarry from which you were hewn." In other words, look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who gave you birth. You were cut from that rock. He's your progenitor. Sarah, his wife, is your progenitor. "When I called him, he was only one man, and I blessed him and made him many." And so with that reference in Deutero-Isaiah, then we have this connection of Abraham with his wife Sarah as the earliest progenitor of the Israelites, including this idea that God had taken one man and blessed him and made him many. So the image that exists in Genesis has Abraham envisioning his posterity as future posterity as being as numerous as the stars. And so he had been a guy as the ancestor. When you go all the way through that whole book of records, from Adam to Abraham, he's the starting point of the whole nation. There's only one of him, and God makes him many. So if we look at Micah is one of the minor prophets, and the actual historical Micah would have been a contemporary, essentially, of Isaiah. But like the book of Isaiah, the book of Micah, as we have it, has been added to, and it only reached the form that we have it in the Second Temple period, either in the Persian part or even as late as the Hellenistic period. And so the single reference we have in Micah to Abraham also connects him with Jacob as a progenitor. So in Micah chapter 7, we read, "You will be faithful to Jacob and show love to Abraham, as you pledged on oath to our ancestors in days long ago." So again, taking these ancestors, but introducing here also that God is faithful because of a pledge, an oath, a covenant that God has made long ago. So Micah here, there's awareness of Abraham and Jacob as both progenitors, but also involving a covenant. The prophet Ezekiel, as we mentioned, is active at the time of the exile. So after Jerusalem has been destroyed by the Babylonians and leaders of the community have been taken away into exile in Babylon. And again, Ezekiel shows that he's aware of the tradition of Abraham, who is both a progenitor of Israel and also had possession of the land as a single human being who later was multiplied and became many because of God's activities. And so Ezekiel, writing to his fellow exiles, said, the word of the Lord came to me, chapter 33 of the book. He said, "Son of man, the people living in the ruins in the land of Israel are saying, Abraham was only one man, yet he possessed the land. But we are many. Surely the land has been given to us as our possession. Therefore, say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Since you eat meat with the blood still in it, and look to your idols and shed blood, should you then possess the land? You rely on your sword, who do detestable things. Each of you defiles his neighbor's wife. Should you then possess the land?" So it's an interesting, kind of condemnation. This is a common thing that prophets do, is tell people they need to stop their different activities, stop worshiping idols, start obeying commandments like eating meat the proper way, stop, obey the different commandments. So Ezekiel's contemporaries, though, are obviously equating possession of the land of Canaan with a gift that God made to their progenitor, Abraham, when he's just one guy. And Ezekiel here is simply adding with it, okay, if there is any such covenant, that covenant is conditional, and it would require Israelites to obey God's laws, which is the kind of thing that prophets tend to think and say. We have another example in the prophet Jeremiah, who is acted at the very end of the First Temple period and then lives on after Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah are destroyed. He goes into exile, in this case in Egypt, as opposed to everybody else who's off in Babylon. Jeremiah's writings and themes, as we've seen in a bunch of lectures, are associated with the book of Deuteronomy, the fifth of the Pentateuch books, the 5 books attributed to Moses, and also with themes of the Deuteronomic school. So the next set of books, the Deuteronomic histories, which are Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So the book of Jeremiah makes a single reference to Abraham. Jeremiah in chapter 33 says, "This is what the Lord says. If I have not made my covenant with day and night and established the laws of heaven on earth, then I will reject the descendants of Jacob and David, my servant, and will not choose one of his sons to rule over the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For I will restore their fortunes and have compassion on them." So as sure as God has, made day and night, he also has made this covenant, and the promise is there will be a restoration. And so once again, Abraham is understood as a progenitor. In Jeremiah here, he's connected not only with Jacob, But he's also, we have for the first time Isaac mentioned, along with the order of the patriarchs as we find them in Genesis: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so this shouldn't surprise us, as it seems like Jeremiah is maybe familiar again, or part of the same school that is maybe helping produce the Deuteronomic histories, and maybe at least one of the source texts beyond Deuteronomy of the Bible might be familiar with one of the source texts of the Pentateuch, that is. So this same formula, your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is given 7 times in the book of Deuteronomy. And in fact, the book of Deuteronomy never mentions Abraham without also mentioning Isaac and Jacob, so they're just coming together in this kind of a formula, which makes sense, again, because the themes are similar between Jeremiah and these other books. So if we look at those Deuteronomic histories, we find the very same formula in the last of them, in 2 Kings. In chapter 13 of 2 Kings, during the reign of one of the kings of the northern kingdom, King Jehoahaz, we read that Hazael, king of Aram, that is to say the area of Syria, Damascus, Hazael, king of Aram, oppressed Israel throughout the reign of Jehoahaz. But the Lord was gracious to them, the Israelites, and had compassion and showed concern for them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. To this day, he has been unwilling to destroy them or banish them from his presence. So in addition to connecting Abraham to Isaac and Jacob as progenitors, then, we have this Deuteronomic theme of a covenant that God has made dating back to them. So that is a theme that is the Deuteronomic histories are aware of, covenant. In 1 Kings, we have this great story of the prophet Elijah, who is having a big showdown with the wicked priests of Baal, Canaanite god, and he offers a prayer to God, and he speaks to these same 3 progenitors, but instead of saying Jacob, he uses Jacob's alternate name Israel as the eponymous name for the ancestor of the Israelite people. So in the context, again, in his contest with the priests of Baal, Elijah prays. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." And so, of course, at the end of the prayer, Elijah's sacrifice, pillar of fire comes down and consumes the whole thing, where the sacrifices of the priests of Baal, were ignored. So Baal is simply an idol. And then finally, out of the Deuteronomic histories, the last reference we have to Abraham is in the book of Joshua, which provides a much more complete telling of the Abraham tradition. And so this is on the occasion when Joshua has entered the land and he renews the covenant that is the Abrahamic, Isaac, and Jacob covenant at Shechem, the northern capital, the place that is later the site of near the site of the Samaritan temple. So we read in Joshua chapter 24 that he assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, the leaders, the judges, and the officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham," so that's a name we haven't seen except for in the book of Generations. So in other words, not in any of the other extra Torah references in Bible texts. So including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, so Abraham's brother. So long ago, your ancestors lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates, and I led him throughout Canaan, and I gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I assigned the hill country of Seir, that is to say the region of Edom, to Esau. And Jacob and his family went down to Egypt. And so this is a retelling of a lot of the tradition, including this idea that Abraham is another one of these stories, the people, how they get to the land. So Abraham came from the land beyond the Euphrates. God brought him and gave him descendants in Canaan. There's a bunch of descendants, including the Edomites, who are descendants from Esau, which is again confirmed in Genesis. And then the text goes on to talk about Jacob and Joseph in Egypt, and also the story of Moses and Aaron leading the people out of Egypt again. So finally, Abraham is mentioned in 2 of the Psalms. So in terms of, as we're doing this study of all the different places, he is known in books in the Bible outside the 5 books attributed to Moses, the Torah. So the first of these, Psalm 47, is a psalm with a pretty jubilant tone. So it says, "Clap your hands, all you nations, shout to God with cries of joy, for the Lord Most High is awesome, the great King over all the earth. He subdued nations under us, peoples under our feet. He chose our inheritance for us, the pride of Jacob whom he loved. God reigns over the nations. God is seated on his holy throne. The nobles of the nations assemble as the people of the God of Abraham. For the kings of the earth belong to God. God is greatly exalted." So although this isn't fully explicit here, the psalmist may be connecting Abraham with the tradition of being the father of many nations. That, of course, would include the Israelites, while singling Jacob out as Israel's special progenitor, and having them at the top of the pinnacle. So maybe, in this case, an understanding that is pre-exilic, possibly. Psalm 105 has a lot more details. It's a retelling again of the central Pentateuch story, Torah story, beginning with Abraham, followed by Jacob, skipping Isaac, but going to Joseph in Egypt, and including with a lengthy retelling of the Exodus story. So the Psalm 105's author again sees Abraham as progenitor, and also sees him as connected to a covenant about the land of Canaan. So we read in that psalm, "Remember the wonders the Lord has done, his miracles and the judgments he pronounced. You, his servants, the descendants of Abraham, his chosen ones, the children of Jacob. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant forever, the promise he made for 1,000 generations, the covenant he made with Abraham." Oh, we do have Isaac here. So the oath he swore to Isaac, so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, yeah. So, and he confirmed it to Jacob as a decree, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. To you I will give the land of Canaan as the portion you will inherit. So like I say, the psalmist here also connects Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Psalm 105. Nevertheless, it's hard to decide how to date that one. So the Book of Psalms, as we have it, is a collection that is brought together during the Second Temple period. And while some of the individual psalms seem really, really early, they make references to the king and the court of Judah back before that kingdom was destroyed, and so therefore date those texts to the First Temple period. Others are clearly composed during the exile, and lots are composed also during the Persian and Hellenistic periods. And so this one, with its significant retelling of the Torah tradition, it gives the impression maybe of being late, possibly composed after the Torah took its final shape and dependent on it. However, we've looked at this psalm before when we did our lecture on the flood, because it actually gives a different number and order to the plagues on Egypt than the ones that exist in Exodus as we have it. And so one theory is that this psalm The psalmist here has access to one of the source texts or so of the Torah, but not all of it. So what can we say? That's a lot, actually. It's a pretty widespread tradition that exists. People are aware of Abraham within, the Israelite book writing community here, the prophetic and other communities. And so in the books of the Bible, outside the Torah, Abraham is generally well known as a progenitor. He's frequently and very early paired with Jacob, who is one of the names for the eponymous ancestor of the Israelites, the other being Israel. And those earliest prophetic authors at least know that much. Part of the tradition pretty early on is that from one man he becomes a multitude. Out of all of them, as we saw, it was really only the Deutero-Hosea that mentioned Abraham's wife Sarah, but they just aren't giving a lot of details, so she may well be known pretty early on too. By the time we get to Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the destruction of the first temple, the exile, Abraham is very clearly already associated with a covenant that God has made with the Israelites, giving them possession of the land of Canaan. And as you can imagine, once, in the context of people who have had their kingdom destroyed, who go into exile, and then by the time we get especially to the Persian period, when people from Babylon have returned and rebuilt Jerusalem and its temple within the Persian Empire as the capital of a very minor Persian province. Stories of this covenant, stories of both in terms of the Exodus, people going from a foreign land like Egypt and coming back to the Promised Land, or Abraham again coming from Mesopotamia, this same area where the exiles have been, and returning to the land. These become ever more important, and probably the stories that, while already existing, gain more and more emphasis and become the ones that people keep and retell. Like I say, this is a widespread tradition, but as we've seen, there were very few details. So outside the retelling in Joshua and Psalm 115, the biblical authors didn't have a lot of details that they recount of the Abraham story. And so, like I say, it's possible that the compilers of Joshua and that particular psalmist of Psalm 115, they already had access to the Torah or Pentateuch as we have it, or it's also possible that they had access to one of the component texts that were used to create the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch or Torah. So as we mentioned, some of the really famous details that we'll be aware of that maybe have gone unmentioned are, what about the story of Abraham nearly sacrificing Isaac? That they talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they don't reference that story. Or there's no reference in any of these about during the covenant, God changing Abraham's name from an original name, Abram. So in other words, some of these details as we have it in the tradition in Genesis as it exists are not part of the details we see extra outside the Torah. So if we turn now to the Torah's creation, we've had several lectures where we talk about the 5 books attributed to Moses. So within them, there are different clearly identifiable authorial voices. And so, for example, the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th of the 5 books of Moses, is a completely distinct text. And it's even one of the reasons why we give it the name Deuteronomy, which means in Greek second law, is that the whole story is sort of finished, and then we have another book that kind of tells it again, or tells about the law again. Then within the other 4 of the books, one of the voices is very clearly stands out, which is the P author or the priestly author. And the priestly author is incredibly interested in all of the different rituals, all of the different types of vessels that are necessary in order to perform all of the priestly functions. And then the other voice that is very, very clear is the Yahwist voice, the J source, as it's sometimes called. And this is the more, let's say, clever, courtly kind of author who is telling stories that are, humorous, that don't always seem particularly what we would think of as a religious book. And these are one of the reasons why the stories have so much character. And so regardless of how the Torah was formed, we can identify those voices within it. So the different options in terms of Torah formation are the supplementary hypothesis and the documentary hypothesis that explains this idea. So the supplementary one imagines that essentially there was an initial text to which people kept on adding things as they expand the text. And so there is a distinct J-source author who has added to Deuteronomy, for example. Deuteronomy is a distinct its own book, so J-source is at the beginning of the rest of the 4 books tradition, to which then a priestly author later adds all kinds of additional expansions, and that ultimately, by expansion, becomes the Pentateuch as we have it. The more complicated idea is that there are multiple voices, Deuteronomy, the Yahwist, the Elohist, and the priestly author, who wrote entirely distinct books. So Deuteronomy all by itself, the other 3 being edited together at different stages. So the Yahwist and Elohist source redacted together to form a single JE source, which was known to the priestly writer who didn't like it, who wrote a alternative Torah, and then a later Second Temple period redactor brought the JE and priestly things together by putting texts side by side and trying to delete very little or edit and change very little. And so in either case, what we have for sure is different authorial voices within the text, at least 2 of which are quite identifiable, the Yahwist and the priestly source, Deuteronomy being its own separate thing. And so that has to be accounted for in one of the ways. And so in either theory, the priestly author is seen as being later writing either at the very end, possibly of the First Temple period, possibly during the exile, or as most people I think, writing in the Second Temple period. And with the Yahwist source maybe being a First Temple, and same thing, Elohist source at the end of the First Temple period. All right, so we already saw that among those things is also then there are things like the Book of Generations, which seem to have been freestanding texts that also get incorporated in that aren't part of any of the voices. And so we already saw that in that Book of Generations, Abraham comes at the very end of it. And so in chapter 11 of Genesis, at the very end of this list of patriarchs, we read, when Nahor had lived 29 years, he became the father of Terah. Then Nahor lived after the birth of Terah 119 years and had other sons and daughters. When Terah lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So this is the end of this succession where it starts with Adam and Adam's son Seth and takes us all the way down to Abraham. Or actually, as we saw in the text here, it actually says Abram. So in all of the sources we've considered thus far, so in other words, the whole tradition of the biblical writers outside of the book of Genesis, the progenitor's name has been given as Abraham, and here it appears for the first time as Abram. So the tradition that God changed the name of the patriarch from Abram to Abraham is found in Genesis 17, and this is one of the passages by the priestly author. And this is the priestly author's account of the Abrahamic covenant. And so in Genesis chapter 17, we read, "When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, 'I am God Almighty. I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless.'" So one of the things that the documentary hypothesis talks about is this idea that in some of the versions, specifically the Elohist document and the priestly document, God only reveals God's special name, Yahweh, to Moses at the burning bush on Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, depending on which of the texts is talking about it. And so when in the priestly source, therefore, God is appearing to Abraham, or Abram here, he hasn't yet revealed his name. And so he appears as God Almighty, El Shaddai, God Almighty. So, "I will make a covenant between me and you, and I will make you exceedingly numerous." Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations." And so the name change here includes a folk etymology that goes ancestor of a multitude. "I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring, and after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land where you now are an alien, all the land of Canaan, for a perpetual holding, and I will be their God." So, as is the priestly author's wont, the account goes on in a pretty legalistic detail to indicate that the sign of this covenant, this Abrahamic covenant, is going to be the circumcision of every male in Abraham's family and all the slaves he has and so forth, which is to be done at the age of 8 days old and so forth. So very interested in all of those kinds of priestly rules is the P author. So this tradition, like I say, of the name change, this is found only in the priestly account of the covenant. And like I say, the priestly author is generally understood to be the latest voice in the Pentateuch Torah. And so in other words, the J source or the D source would have been written earlier. And so maybe the reason why this tradition of the name change isn't known or isn't mentioned anyway by any of the other extra biblical authors is because it maybe hadn't been introduced yet. And if that's the case, either the other voices would have had their own name change story, or more likely a redactor has edited Abraham's name to Abram in all of the other source texts that are used prior to the place in the story where the priestly author makes the name change. And so in the original book of generations, if there had been a freestanding document, it would have ended with Abraham instead of Abram. When we look at the names, both Abram and Abraham likely share the same actual ancient etymology, where we have that B that is going to mean father, Ab, and Ram, which means high or exalted. And so both names likely mean exalted father. But as is so often the case when there is a name that is old in ancient tradition and predates when the priestly author is writing or when the Yahwist author is writing, they'll make up an etymology. And so we saw that with Moses, which the Yahwist author says is derived from Pharaoh's daughter saying, "Because I drew you from the water," when in fact it's almost certainly that's not the origin of the name Moses. It's just what it sounds like in Hebrew. So similarly here, the folk etymology for Abraham is either an etymology or a pun, where we take that Ab, meaning father, and the word Haman meaning multitude for Abhaman, but that's not really where Abraham comes from. And so again, like I say, that's probably an indication that the tradition of Abraham long predates the priestly writer, and we have that confirmed by all of the instances we've seen, both extra-biblical writers at least being aware of Abraham as a progenitor associated with Jacob. So each of the major voices that we find in Genesis, so the Yahwist or J source, the Elohist or E source, the priestly author, they all tell Abraham stories, which is why there are a lot of Abraham stories in Genesis. And like I say, he becomes the first major figure. And that also, though, leads to several doublets. A doublet is when we have two distinct sources and they tell the same story, and then when it's combined together, they exist side by side. The other possibility is that, again, if it's a supplementary hypothesis, it's a little harder to explain why they do it, but essentially the person would write their own version of it, and even though they kept the old version in there. In addition, the editor or redactor of Genesis has included a bunch of materials that have independent voices that don't seem to be any one of the major writers, some of which seem very obscure. So we looked already at the Book of Generations as maybe a pre-existing document that is about Abraham that doesn't have anything much more than his name in a genealogy list, but nevertheless becomes important for connecting him to the antediluvian patriarchs and Adam. But we have another odd story that again doesn't match any of the major voices, where Abraham is a participant in a story of a battle between 9 different kings. We talked about this at a lot of length in our lecture on Methuselah. So Genesis chapter 14 is a very obscure story where Abraham figures as a main character. Also, Lot is part of the story. And it also includes this very mysterious figure, Melchizedek, whose name means righteous king. So we read in Genesis chapter 14, in the days of King Amraphel of Shinar, King Arioch of Elasar, King Chedorlaomer of Elam, and King Tidal of Goyim, these kings made war with King Bera of Sodom, King Bersha of Gomorrah, King Shinab of Admah, King Shemember of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. So all of these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the valley where the Dead Sea is. So historically, if we take those first set of kings, Elam is an actual historical kingdom in southwestern Iran. Shinar is the biblical name for Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. And so essentially we have 4 great kings of the east from kind of the direction, the other side of the Euphrates, from the land of Canaan. They come and attack 5 much smaller kings of what are essentially the mythical city-states, Sodom, Gomorrah, Zeboim, Admah, these towns that are destroyed in Genesis, and essentially as an ideological myth that explains why is the Dead Sea dead, why is there a desert all around there? God destroyed this region, and so there's mythic cities that are imagined to explain that extremely salty dead zone. And we also have from this story and the rest of the Genesis tradition the idea that within this region, Abraham's nephew Lot lives. And so after these great eastern kings win the battle against these more petty kings of these little city-states, they then take a bunch of hostages, including Lot. So they take him captive, and that prompts Abraham's intervention. So when Abram heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, the men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So Dan is the northernmost extreme of the northern kingdom of Israel. So Abram divided his forces against these 4 kings of the east by night, he and his servants, and he routed them, and he pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the goods, and also he brought back his nephew Lot with his goods, and the women and the people. So everybody, all of the booty that these attacking kings had gotten, Abraham, because of his victory, he's able to recover all of that loot. And so it's sort of kind of an amazing story. Also, even though Abraham is simply portrayed as like a wealthy man with a large household, he and his allies, who are the Amorites in this story, are able to rout these armies of 4 great kings who are going back home victorious. And so in the next part of the story, after the victory, this is the part that we emphasized in our lecture on Melchizedek. Abraham offers tithes to Melchizedek. And that, of course, has led to centuries of speculation, like I said, that we talked about in that lecture, about who should this character of Melchizedek be? How do we understand him? And then this obscure story in Genesis 14 concludes with a conversation between Abraham and the king of Sodom, who has been his sort of erstwhile ally. So the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the persons that you've been able to rescue, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have sworn to God Most High, El Shaddai, the maker of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, so that you might not say, I have made Abram rich. So I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. In other words, my Amorite allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. So let those guys take their share, but I'm not going to take any of the booty from Sodom and Gomorrah, because he wants to, even if we're allies, I don't want it to be said that you made me rich. So it's an interesting exchange. It seems to give us a kind of little glimpse into traditions about Abraham that predate the compilation of Genesis. Again, it's a story that this is all we have from it that survived because it got inserted into Genesis. In that Abram is allied with the Amorites, and although he again fights against the enemies of this mythical king of Sodom, he wants to make sure that this is understood to be an alliance of convenience. He is not a vassal of that king. So like I say, because each of the major voices in Genesis, the Yahwist, the Elohist, and the priestly source, tell long Abraham stories, there are lots of doublets and even triplets. In other words, the same story being told multiple times. So when we started looking in Genesis, when we looked at the change of Abraham's name from Abram to Abraham, that was embedded in the priestly version of the covenant. So really the covenant that God makes with Abraham about both the land and also making a one man into a multitude is pretty much the most important thing in the Abraham story. And so, like I say, in the priestly version, that involved a name change. And typically it's expressed by a priestly ritual, circumcision, something that the priests are especially worried about. What are the rituals and rules? So the Yahwist, or the J version of the covenant story, is found right after this War of the Nine Kings story. So it's in Genesis chapter 15, where we read, after these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue to be childless. The heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. Abraham said, you have given me no offspring. So a slave born in my house, Eleazar of Damascus, he has to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. And the Lord brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them. Then he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. And then as he continues in the story, I'm missing a slide there, what we also have is the whole extent of the land that's going to be given. So it's going to be given everything from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, all of Canaan. That includes the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So again, one of the things that happened in that middle part before God reckons that is in the J story, this covenant is sealed by Abraham offering a sacrifice. And so he collects a whole bunch of animals, which included like a ram and a pigeon and a turtle dove and so forth. And he offers an animal sacrifice to the Lord. And the Lord, in seeing that, makes this covenant and gives him all of the land, and that's the sign of the covenant. And that sacrifice story is something that would never happen in the priestly telling of the covenant. So the priestly author considers himself to be a descendant of Aaron via Aaron's descendant Zadok, the high priest under David. And so the eponymous ancestor of the Aaronid priests, they call themselves the Zadokites, or Sadducees, is Zadok. And so it's very important that in their telling of the story that Aaron is the first person to be allowed to offer sacrifices, and it's a right that belongs only to Aaron and his descendants. And so all of the stories that we know about earlier in Genesis where sacrifices occurred. So for example, when Noah offers a sacrifice to God after the flood, and God responds with a rainbow, which is a Noachic covenant that God is not going to again destroy the world with a flood. That is clearly not a priestly story because Noah is offering a sacrifice, and that simply doesn't happen. So the same thing is true here. This is a Yahwist story of the covenant because it involves Abraham offering a sacrifice, which he doesn't do in the priestly versions of the story. So there's also a more famous story of Abraham offering a sacrifice, and that is, of course, his sacrifice or almost sacrifice of Isaac. And this has been identified as an Elohist or E story. Like I say, this is by proponents of the documentary hypothesis. And so between the two hypotheses, the documentary and the supplementary hypothesis, is the question about whether you can really identify this E source. And so not everybody agrees that this would be an E source, but what we can say about it is it's clearly not a priestly story, and it's a third version of the covenant story. So maybe the Elohist version. So Abraham is famously commanded by God to offer Isaac, his long-awaited son, by Sarah as a human sacrifice. So he, in this Genesis as we have it, he has already been able to have an elder son, Ishmael, by his wife's handmaiden, Hagar. But this is Sarah's now long-awaited child, Isaac. And so we read, this sacrifice would have been in keeping with the long-standing Canaanite practice or practice in Canaanite religion that is actually listed as a commandment in Exodus, which is also Exodus chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, which is also a passage that is identified as an e-source passage. So in that verse we read, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Consecrate to me all the firstborn, whichever it is to open the womb among the Israelites of human beings and animals is mine.'" So the firstborn of every womb is mine, says the Lord. And so this is an idea that in Canaanite religion, that there is both for animals but also for humans. There's human sacrifice where the first born male child is supposed to be sacrificed. And this is something that the Bible routinely condemns, but it's a practice that it sees happening in the contemporary Canaanite religion. And it's something that, for example, the heirs of Canaanite religion in the form of the Phoenician settlers in Carthage, this is something that has been documented among the Carthaginians as well. And so the sacrifice of Isaac's story is Genesis 22. That's also an e-source, an Elohist passage. So we read in that chapter back in Genesis, after these things, God, Elohim, tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And Abraham said, here I am. God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I'll show you. And so Abraham duly brings Isaac. Isaac doesn't know what's going on. Isaac sees that they're going to go do a sacrifice, but he asks, where's the sheep for the burnt offering? And Abraham sort of tells him, well, God will provide. And when they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him upon the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. So in the version of the story that we have it, of course, an angel of the Lord appears and stops Abraham from offering the sacrifice, substituting a ram. However, some biblical scholars, including Richard Elliott Friedman, have argued that this may not have been the original story. If the e-source exists, if the e-source has been a distinct text that has been combined together by redactors, then the redactors have possibly added this story of the angel coming and offering a substitute sacrifice. And he argues that when this can be read this way because when the e-source picks up again, God says to Abraham, because you've done this and you've not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you. And I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. And by your offspring shall all nations of the earth gain blessings for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and then Abraham lived at Beersheba. So, we don't have here, it doesn't say Abraham returned with Isaac to Beersheba. It just Abraham returned with his young men. God is saying in this text, because you didn't hold back your son. In other words, it doesn't say because you were willing to sacrifice him but didn't have to do it. Anyway, so, and also the other interesting thing is if you go to the next e-source story, Abraham finds a new wife. So maybe Sarah has either died, or maybe this thing that happened has caused her to drop dead. That part of the story is not there. And this new wife, Keturah, is the one who gives Abraham a multitude of sons in the e-sources, nor are there any Isaac stories in the Elohist text. So whether or not that's what happens, what we can say is that this story is a backdrop for the E-version of the covenant, making these covenant stories a triplet. So God seems to make this covenant multiple times with Abraham. Actually, what we're having is 3 different, very dramatic stories of why the covenant is made, or how. So I just want to talk just a little bit about the moral of the sacrifice story. So as it gets edited together in the redactors, in especially Second Temple Judaism, it's very important to the prophetic voices, the priestly voices in Second Temple Judaism to expunge this earlier Canaanite practice which, again, Israelites are emerging out of the Canaanites, so is something that will have been practiced. And so making a story where Abraham is supposed to sacrifice his only son, but then making it so that instead of that, God makes it very clear, no, let's not do this. We should sacrifice instead an animal, and that will be a substitute. That is a way we can end this previous practice. And ultimately, this also gets worked into the Exodus story with the last plague on the Egyptians. And so once again, the angel of death, the god of death, that has been requiring the firstborn male of every womb, the way they are turned away is by following the law of substitution. So you sacrifice a ram and you paint the blood over the doors of the lintel to show that the substitution has been paid. We are not going to be continuing on with that archaic practice that had existed before. Unfortunately, then, because so that's a really good thing to stop that kind of practice, as I would say. Unfortunately, because of how the story then is adapted and becomes a test, certainly as this story gets interpreted in Christianity in the New Testament authors look to this and say that this just shows what an incredible obedient guy Abraham is that he's willing to kill his own son because he'll do anything that the Lord tells him to do, and ultimately for me, I feel like this is that isn't the moral I would want to draw from this at all. I think Abraham shouldn't be doing what the Lord says if the Lord is going to tell him to do awful things. And so from modern reinterpretation, if it's going to be understood as a test, I would say that that's a test that Abraham actually fails. But again, what we have here is a tradition and a story that gets repurposed in different stages when it's needed for different things. All right, so in addition to having a triplet in terms of how the covenant is made between the priestly, the Yahwist, and the Elohist stories, Yahwist and the Elohist also tell another fascinating story of Abraham and Sarah when they take refuge at a royal court and they decide not to tell the foreign king that they are staying with that they're married. And so the Yahwist version is set in Egypt, and we read in Genesis 12, there was a famine in the land of Canaan, so Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. And of course, Egypt is always able to resist localized famines because the Nile is getting its water from outside of the same climate zone, and so it's consistent. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, which is the pre-name change version of Sarah, he said to his wife Sarai, I know well that you are a woman, beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they'll say, this is his wife. And then they'll want to kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. And so when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that his wife, the woman, was very beautiful. And when the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, Pharaoh dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep and oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys and camels. So Abraham's come out pretty good from this. Doesn't seem so great for Sarai, who's now a concubine apparently in Pharaoh's house. The Lord then afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife, take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they sent him on his way. with his wife and all of the booty that he's been gotten from the being in favor from Pharaoh before. So both Abraham's sojourn here in Egypt and also the plagues that are brought upon Egypt, they prefigure the story that Jay and the other source voices are going to tell in Exodus, that in terms of, in other words, the plagues that Moses brings on Pharaoh and so forth, the fact that the Israelites then leave Egypt much richer and despoil Egypt. And it shows Abraham as someone who can outwit his much more powerful neighbors, and so therefore as a important ethnic hero for people who are a tiny people next to much more powerful great empires in Mesopotamia and Egypt. So the E source, the Elohist, also tells a similar story, but sets it in a place called Gerar. So while residing in Gerar as an alien, Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." And King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah, and that just means like father of the king or kingly father, something like that. So it may just be a title like Pharaoh. And God said to Abimelech in a dream by night, God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "You're about to die because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a married woman." Now Abimelech had not approached her. So in this story, we have a different outcome for Sarah anyway. So he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, 'She is my sister'?" And she herself said, "He is my brother. So I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands," Abimelech complains to God. And so unlike the J story where Sarah is actually taken into the house of Pharaoh as a concubine, the E story anyway protects her virtue as God intervenes to warn off the foreign king. In this version, when asked to explain himself, Abraham adds the detail, "Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." So he has married his half-sister, and that's explaining why the story makes sense, or can be on the one hand true, but on the other hand sneaky and tricky, showing Abraham as a clever person who outwits his neighbors and also plunders them. I also want to look at one more kind of key story, the story of Abraham and Sarah giving hospitality to God when God visits them. God visits them in the form of three men, but he's recognized as the Lord. So there's lots of other Abraham stories that we could include in our format, but I want to read just this one from the J source because it kind of I think it also is very compelling and explains both of these figures and why they continue to be enduringly popular. So the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, as Abraham sat in the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and he saw three men standing near him. So the Lord is appearing to him, but he's seeing in the form of three men. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them, and he bowed to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So it is a ritual of extending hospitality, one of the central principles of kind of the medieval ancient Near Eastern code, the guest-host relationship. So they said, "Do as you have said." And so Abraham hastened to the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of flour, knead it, make cakes." And this is a practice that we see throughout the Bible, Israelite women making cakes as part of essentially a ritual for giving sacrifices to the gods, and including in this is ultimately a practice that's condemned, as they are making cakes for the Queen of Heaven and things like that. But in any case, in this case, these are being made for the Lord, for Yahweh, who's appeared as three men anyway. So Abraham then ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good. He gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. And then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And as he stood by them under the tree while they ate. So this is also, in giving hospitality, has essentially also potentially, is offering a sacrifice to the Lord. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And Abraham said, "There in the tent." Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and it had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So she is postmenopausal. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I've grown old and my husband is old, shall I be fruitful?" And the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I bear a child now that I'm old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," before she was afraid. And he said, "Yes, you did laugh." So not only does Sarah have the audacity to laugh at Yahweh, she gets caught lying in her denial. "Oh, I didn't laugh." "Yeah, you did." And Yahweh then goes on. So I think that shows a very interesting, again, fun character of Sarah. And Yahweh then explains that they are actually on their way to Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy these cities, of which Lot is associated, as we saw in that other fragment in the War of the 9 Kings. And so that leads Abraham to presume to bargain with the Lord, which once again shows the kind of character that this clever patriarchal figure has. So Abraham came near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? You're going to destroy a whole city here. Are you going to destroy the good people? Suppose there are 50 righteous people within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not forgive it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" And so the Lord said, "If I find in Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will forgive the whole place for their sake." And so having agreed that the city would be spared if 50 righteous souls could be found, that sort of leaves the door open just enough for Abraham to, stick his foot in there, so he's not going to see anybody potentially for bargaining. And so he goes on from there and he says, "Well, what about if there's 45? And so God's like, "Okay, yes, 45 is fine as well." Takes it from there to 40, to 30, to 20, and eventually down to 10, which is as far as Abraham's willing to press his luck. Although then, as we read, the total number of righteous in the city is in fact Lot and his family, and so the city isn't spared. Instead, Lot and his family are made to leave as the city is destroyed. And this is again set in the story of Abraham and Sarah offering hospitality, and of course the great crime of Sodom and Gomorrah is not only a refusal of hospitality, but as the visitors come, the city's custom is to gang rape everybody, and so this whole place then becomes destroyed, and that's the ideological myth that explains the Dead Sea. So as I say, these stories, especially the Yahwist and the Elohist story, but anyway, the fact that there are multiple voices that are combining to make these characters interesting, self-contradictory in some cases, and well-rounded, are one of the reasons I think that they continue to resonate. If the priestly author had simply written their own version of the Pentateuch instead of either adding their version, or maybe if they did write their own version and they intended to have it replaced, but then the redactor ended up putting their text next to the others, that ended up making the sum of the whole anyway so much stronger than the individual parts. And this idea of trying to rewrite and sanitize and fix stories, the Deuteronomic histories that we have, everything from Joshua to Kings, that was reworked and sanitized by the chronicler, who reworked them as First and Second Chronicles. And if that's all we had, it would be a much, a much less rich story. And same thing is potentially possible if we only had the priestly version of the Torah. And so that is my look at what can we know about Abraham, all the way up through the character as a central figure in Genesis. What was the tradition that existed before then, or whatever we can say of the remains of that tradition. And of course, what happens in terms of how Abraham gets understood by the different traditions that still look back to him is a topic for another lecture. And so in the meantime, as we're doing this, as Mike is collecting kind of your comments and questions, I'm going to get a glass of water and we can continue. So to begin with, I want to thank folks who have been offering donations or giving donations and support, both in the lecture today. JM, thank you for your support. Pugli's in Australia, thank you so much for your support. We also have had a bunch of YouTube Super Thanks contributors who are not contributing in the live, but go later, as their practice is to do this once they've been posted and they watch later. And so thanks also to Always Ask Why, to Boo Kian Ku, to CC Ryder, to Canis Ronis, to Cliff Fornwalt. Thank you also to Cornelia Taylor, to Demaglot, to Edward Contreras, to Elodie Salgado, to God of the Gaps. Thanks also to Jaeger Ube, to John O'Brien, to Larkwright, to Laura Alexander, to Mark Long. Thanks also to Nathan, to Roderick Dalmacchio, Tomasio, and Ryan M. and William Gazale. So here are some of the questions people have been asking. Felix Fortuna Rex says, an archaeologist named Eli Shukran found a temple in the city of David above the Gihon Spring, right where the Bible says it should be. It almost sounds like the first temple's been found. Okay, well that's an interesting thing. I'll have to Eli Shukran. So I'll look that up, and I haven't seen that, but I'll be interested to see what's been being done there. I've been a couple years ago when I was able to go to Jerusalem as part of a delegation for Churches for Middle East Peace, was able to see that component of the city of David, which is under it's a Palestinian neighborhood that's under a lot of threat, because of course it has a lot of archaeological excitement for people, but is obviously also an active neighborhood. Asghar Farouk Katak says, if you know all this man Abraham made, then why have new men made new religions? If you know all this man Abraham made, then why have new men made new religions? Well, in a lot of cases, the different new religions that are Abrahamic nevertheless consider themselves to be, all of them consider themselves to be direct heirs. And so, for example, as I say, Islamic tradition is that essentially all of these patriarchs, including Abraham, are prophets of God, and essentially they're all have been essentially Muslim the entire time, and they trace back their tradition anyway all the way back to creation as how they understand it. And so in other words, they consider Islam to be a direct continuation of this mythic time of Abraham, and that's also true in Rabbinic Judaism. Christians entirely consider themselves heirs to Abraham. The New Testament says so all the time. So in that sense, no one usually don't consider their religions to be new. Usually religions have claims to antiquity. So when I talk about religions being new, I'm talking about that from the more like of historical realities of how all of history is about continuity and change. So people are always making new things within their own time frame, because otherwise, if you try to do anything that was exactly like how things were in, let's say, just even 200 or 300 BC, it would just be completely alien from our lives today. So Austin Lewis says, I know many Bible stories are similar to other cultures' stories in the region. So for example, the flood story, the creation myth. Are there similar stories to Abraham's with other cultures? So yeah, I was just thinking about that because we had talked about just that thing, all of the different connections, for example, that the Eden story have with other Middle Eastern creation myths, the flood story, as you mentioned. And I was trying to think of this story specifically of, like Abraham and Sarah going and visiting, staying in the houses of other kings and, tricking them by saying that he's my sister. I'm not aware of that existing in any other story. Also, it'd be interesting. I'm also not thinking of any other stories where a leader is called upon to, sacrifice his own child in this kind of way. I guess those are some of the most famous Abraham stories. And so, I guess the other most important story is, being promised that you'll have a multitude of descendants. And I have to look for that. I kind of feel like these are interesting and maybe more unique to Abraham than, let's say, the flood story or the creation story. Nexus Gaming Studios says, Genesis 31:19 describes Rachel's theft of Laban's family idols. How would this fit in with the idea that the Abram story may have been pre-existing and modified in Josiah's era? So yeah, I'd have to look exactly. So the Rachel story there is, and the theft of the family idols is probably I haven't looked at it, but it's probably a Yahwist story. And so the idea of it is that the Yahwist story, the J source, is possibly or probably pre-exilic, or at least if it's later, it seems to be a courtly narrative, and the author of it doesn't have the kind of sensibilities that the priestly writers have, and so a woman, taking advantage of her father by stealing his household gods, would have been that kind of a courtly story that's showing how people, are able to, play tricks essentially, or outwit other people in order to be able to retain favors and different powers. And so it's very much in keeping with other things that are happening in terms of the Yahwist author. In terms of the Josiah reforms, so this is when, at the end of the First Temple period, there's beginning to be really a focus on monolatry or henotheism, where we're trying to centralize just the worship of the one God and forbid worship of all the other gods. And so this particular story is able to make it in because without getting fully edited out or deleted like other stories would be, because it isn't entirely clear, to all the readers that what she's bringing is, the family idols. She's bringing something, but I think that it's able to maybe slip by or slip through like that, in the same way that we have, again, these other kinds of footprints of a broader pantheon of polytheism. That the story that I read in the Yahwist tale, where essentially God is appearing as three as three men? Is that is there an edit here or a part of the story where there's a bigger pantheon at one point? In some cases, angels or potentially other gods that have been downgraded to angels. The angel of death is possibly that is requiring this firstborn sacrifice and is causing and is getting passed over, is potentially a footprint of an earlier god of death. So all of these edits are trying to repicture an earlier tradition that is pretending that monotheism goes all the way back to the beginning, when actually the real practice is that the religion is emerging out of a more general Canaanite polytheism, and it is the tradition itself is becoming monotheistic, especially by the time you get into the Second Temple period. Jeremias Bazan says, why do we think the Israelites invented a story where they come from outside of Canaan instead of being natives to the land? So, like I kind of say with an origin story, you have those sort of two options. You either decide you're from there or you decide you're from somewhere else. So the Romans end up, with a story that's, in the Aeneid, that they are not from Italy, but rather that they're descendants of Trojan refugees. And so they may have picked up or stolen that story from the Etruscans, who may have themselves told that story about themselves. But neither of those is the case. So they're not Trojan refugees. The Etruscans are from there, and so that's they just emerged out of that location. The Romans are, since they're Indo-European speakers, at a certain point Indo-Europeans did enter into Italy, but the Romans are also partially descended from the Etruscans, so they're kind of half from there. They're half from a land migration of these Indo-European peoples. Anyway, they didn't know that, and so they're coming up with an origin story, and they're telling it in order to connect themselves to Greek culture that they admire, and also to write themselves into the great epic of ancient Greece, but not without making them be Greeks. They're the other guys. They're the Trojans, who are also very, very presented very nobly in the Iliad. And so in the same way, Israelites have these origin stories where, on the one hand, there's one where they are descended from Abraham, that's coming out of the one great civilization to the east of them, Mesopotamia. And then the other one is they come from Egypt and have left Egypt which is the other great civilization on the other side of them. And so I think that those are two different origin stories that then really resonate and become very important in the Second Temple period, when the exiles themselves have physically returned to the land from their time in Babylon. And so it spoke to them very much. And so there might have been multiple other stories, but as they get edited together, the ones that are kept and retained and resonate the most, are these stories of coming back into the land, or coming into the land. And so those are what the prophets are talking about, and as something they're holding up when the first temple is destroyed, and it's something that the later editors and writers are focusing on when the exiles come back. Ricky Palacio says, is there any noticeable difference in the Abraham of the Hebrew Bible and the Abraham of the Old Testament and Genesis? So yeah, Ricky, so when I talk about the Hebrew Bible and I talk about the Old Testament, those are the same thing. So the only reason I usually switch back and forth between these, and I say the Hebrew Bible, or I say which is the Jewish way of talking about the Bible, and I also talk about the Old Testament, which is the Christian name for the Hebrew Bible. Those are synonyms. The Old Testament within Catholic and Orthodox tradition has more books than the rabbinic canon of the Hebrew Bible, so rabbinic Judaism. And so it has the other books that Catholicism calls the deuterocanonical books. So this is things like the books of Maccabees and things. And those are because they were in the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, that is the basis of the Christian Old Testament. But Genesis is exactly the same book in the Hebrew Bible and in the Old Testament. I mean, the only difference would be, are there changes between the Hebrew text and the text as it's translated into the Septuagint? And those are simply, I think, mostly translation changes. It's not like the difference between Daniel in the original Aramaic and Hebrew version, and then the Greek version has additional parts that are not in the Aramaic and Hebrew versions. So no, I'd say there's no difference. Green Country Agroforestry says, so bottom line, what's the earliest datable Abraham story that we can dig up? I was poking about, I found Abraham and Ishmael in early forms in Syria around 2500 before the Common Era, but not associated with the biblical Abraham. So they're just, names that can be in use that early. So like I was saying, Green Country Agroforestry, that the problem, we already have in Genesis both Abram and Abraham as versions of the name, and so this particle ab, is in Semitic it's related to the word for father, and so whenever you're going to get into some kind of unimportant ancestor, having the name ab, as part of that is going to not be that unusual. And same thing. Ishmael or whatever also has, the same kinds of Semitic, common Semitic consonants. And because, again, in a lot of these writing systems, the vowels aren't even there, you can find variations on these names. But what we don't have with any of those kinds of names is an association with an actual Abraham story as part of the Abraham tradition that we have. And so the earliest ones that we have of that is, like I say, with any story attached, as the prophetic writers from the First Temple period who are aware of Abraham as a progenitor, and then by the time we're getting to the very end of the First Temple period, also they're aware of a tradition of a covenant that God is making with Abraham to make one man into many. So maybe the very beginning of this line of the progenitors, and possibly also that again he's from a different place. He's come to Canaan, which part of the covenant is that is to possess the land of Canaan. Smuggy Rob says, are there any Indo-European influences on the Hebrew Bible? So yeah, I mean, I think that Indo-Europeans are all over the place and have extended into they're not as close into the biblical area as all that, because it's the center is between the Semitic speakers and then also the Egyptian speakers, the Afro-Asiatic, and so that's kind of the core. But for example, the Hittites, who are remembered anyway in the Bible, and spoken Indo-European language, and so they will have had some influences on that. It's not really remembered, but there are essentially the biblical version of the Hittites are like Neo-Hittites, so later Hittites, but after the fall of the actual Hittite Empire and the Bronze Age collapse. Also during the Bronze Age collapse is when the Philistines, who are most certainly one of the Sea Peoples, are settled by the Egyptians in what becomes Philistia, Palestine, and so they are almost certainly I mean, they're almost certainly related to the Mycenaeans, and so they're probably an Indo-European speaking people that are there, and so the Philistines are a major, by the time the Bible's written, the Philistines, the Bible writers have forgotten that the Philistines aren't just from there. They assume they're just from there. And by that point, they've also completely assimilated into, having local Canaanite language and customs and so forth, but they will have already been providing, some background influence. And then ultimately, ongoing Hellenic influence happens in the Hebrew Bible, which because of there's a lot of contact and interaction even during the Persian period with the Greeks, many of whom have been conquered by and incorporated into the Persian Empire. So the whole west coast of Anatolia is settled by Greeks, and those become part of the Persian Empire. And then, of course, after Alexander, the whole area has a lot of Hellenistic influences, and texts are still, maybe in their final forms being edited and added to. And some of the last ones, like for example, Daniel, is definitely written in the Hellenistic period and is, very cognizant of the Seleucid kings and other things. So there's definitely Indo-European in the sense of Indo-European descendant speakers like the Greeks and the Hittites. So, Operation Ivy says, is it possible the name Abraham shares some kind of linguistic background with Brahma and Brahmin? So I don't know. So I don't know what the linguistic background of Brahma and Brahmin are. So we're just talking about the Indo-Europeans, and so the Brahmins are part of, one of the reasons why Indo-European languages include the word Indo is because Hindi, anyway, the Sanskrit is as one of the Indo-European languages, and so it's possible that that's actually, has some kind of Indo-European root as opposed to Abraham, which would be a Semitic root, and so in that case, it probably wouldn't have any relationship. Patty O'Reilly says, is it likely that Moses happened upon texts from Jacob's son Joseph in Pharaoh's house of his records which mentioned Abraham and Akhenaten, which inspired Moses' mission to free his people from Atmosa, the first of Egypt? It's certainly something that people would love for that to be true. So in other words, being able to connect Moses and Israelite monotheism with Akhenaten and is something that people would like to do. They just not ever able to be found any link for that. It is anachronistic to have imagined like some kind of a connection, because again, the Israelite religion only becomes monotheist much later, and so it's not as a direct result of anything that anybody remembers about Akhenaten, but is instead, I think, part of a later thing that's happening in the axial age that is also happening in ancient Greek religion, where the philosophers are also beginning to see behind all of the gods a single source. And so it's just an idea that multiple people can have, and as much as we would love it to have connected to Akhenaten, we have done a whole lecture on Akhenaten, that there doesn't seem to be any connection. Likewise, in terms of Moses and Joseph, those are also like Abraham, not historic figures. So we're talking about mythic figures, and so there are no records that we have from Egypt about them. We had a whole lecture on why, unfortunately, for Moses is set in a time period when, in fact, the Egyptian Empire included all of the land of Canaan, and so an Exodus, no matter how much you're wandering in the wilderness, you would only end up back in lands ruled by Egypt if you went to Canaan. Ron Wagner says, isn't it true that Muslims believe that Ishmael was the one to be sacrificed and not Isaac? Yes. So yeah, like I said, Ron, I wasn't able to go through all of the traditions that are subsequent to the Bible. We took a whole lecture just to look at all of the biblical traditions and anything that might possibly exist to predate biblical traditions, to see where the sources for this Abraham tradition are. But yeah, like you say, each of the traditions has evolved subsequently. So Abraham has lots of mentions in the New Testament. Of course, Abraham has lots of mentions in the Talmud, the rabbinic writings, and Abraham is also mentioned in the traditional stories and sayings and teachings ascribed to Muhammad. And included in that is the idea that actually this story that exists in Genesis about the sacrifice of Isaac, that it was actually Ishmael that was the one who was going to be sacrificed. But that story is clearly late and dependent on the story in Genesis, which is the original that's been changed. Nexus Gaming Studio says, I thought it was interesting how Abram follows ancient customs without asking God and then gets Ishmael, but then asks God before following a different custom to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael. And I was wondering if there was a theological point being made. Yeah, so yeah, the issue with all of that is that we have multiple different voices with traditions that are coming together there. And so I didn't have time to, as we were doing this, I didn't have time to go through the entire Hagar and Ishmael story. And so it is interesting that God doesn't command in the story of that, God doesn't command Abraham to take Hagar as a handmaiden because his wife Sarah hasn't been having children. That's just something that Sarah suggests, given the reality of this. And then again, this becomes a courtly story because as usual would happen, is that when the lead wife in a royal court, obviously isn't able to have a son at all herself, or when a concubine, let's say, ends up producing a favored son, she can be very much elevated in the court because her son, increases her power and status, especially if that son ends up becoming, the heir, becoming the king. And so one of the things that ends up happening is this becomes then intolerable to Sarah, and rather than wade into the disputes of among wife and concubine, Abram says, well, she's your handmaid and you can choose what to do. And so sends her. It's Sarah who sends her off. Abraham doesn't intervene there. But then God is one that intervenes, and God actually speaks to Hagar and ultimately speaks to Ishmael. So Hagar becomes one of the prophets, a prophetess in the Genesis, because the Lord appears to her and comforts her and tells her that she's going to make a great a nation of her and her son as well. And that becomes the origin story for Bedouins in the Genesis account. Kochira says, so are Abraham and Sarah siblings only in the e-source, or is it possible that them being brother and sister is an older tradition? So I was going to look at that as well, because it does talk about it. There's another reference at the very beginning where, as they're doing sort of generations, where essentially it's mentioning that, at the end of the book of Generations there, we saw that Abraham's father, Terah, has 3 sons, and Lot is the son of one of them, and so that's how that relationship of having a nephew works. I'm trying to think if somewhere in that area it also mentions that Terah has another. It mentions that Terah has a daughter as well by a different one, or if it is only right there in the e-source. And I was going to look it up, but I ran out of time. So it's interesting. I'll have to look it up and put it in the comments of the lecture. K. Tempest Bradford says, it's weird to me that Abraham is hailed as the great ancestor, yet he is a terrible father. He sends his first son away into the desert with nothing. He almost kills or does kill his second son. He's also a terrible husband, poor Sarah, poor Ishmael's mother, Hagar. What is there to revere here? I've heard a simplistic view, Isaac versus Ishmael, described the Israeli versus Arab or Judaism versus Muslim. Can you speak on that? So, yeah, so again, this is what I was kind of saying too in the, the different books of the New Testament hail Abraham and his willingness to obey God, even to the point of sacrificing his own son, although he doesn't end up doing it in the Genesis as we have it, as that's a test of faith and that Abraham passed the test. And certainly that's how it was able to be interpreted still by early Christians and Christians up until very recently. Like I said, whenever I read that, I interpret that as if Abraham is actually being given a test. His willingness to do it is failing the test. But again, this is because when you have stories become scripture, become sacred story, and therefore continue to resonate and speak to people in different times, we're gonna look at it and interpret it very differently. And so, as you say, for our understanding of how we view what fatherhood is and how fathers should behave and things like that in the 21st century, Abraham doesn't have a great track record here, but again, he is being written about in a time period that has different values that are trying to say different things. I don't actually think he's also necessarily being held up as a model of how a good father behaves, but rather that he is, the importance is that he is the progenitor of all of these nations. In terms of the taking Isaac and Ishmael to, or I guess it would, Jacob and I guess it's Isaac and Ishmael. Jacob and Israel, Isaac and Ishmael, or Isaac's son Jacob, who is Israel, as a shorthand for Israel versus Arab or Jewish versus Muslim. These are just when people are taking shorthands even today, in the same way that all of the prophets are speaking to the Israelite people, and they'll say, hear me, O Jacob, and they're using that eponymous mythic ancestor as a shorthand for the people. And so that can still be done and people still do it, but obviously the conflicts are not sometimes portrayed as that these are conflicts that are super ancient and go all the way back. Actually, a lot of these are very new. There is a lot of tradition anyway through a bunch of the Middle Ages where Jewish people were, let's say, given more tolerance sometimes in Muslim nations than in Christian nations, depending on what time. I mean, Jewish people were also received varying levels of tolerance in Christian nations or terrible persecutions and pogroms in Christian nations as well. So it's always, it's hard to really generalize for any of this. The current conflicts are really tied up with the modern foundation of a state of Israel and the ongoing occupation or military occupation of the Palestinian people by the Israeli military. Certified Genius, thank you so much for your support. K. Tempest Bradford also asks, are there any traditions of Abraham outside of Hebrew, Christian, or Islamic holy texts? So not earlier ones. So we don't have any traditions of Abraham earlier, outside of them later. In other words, what texts that are dependent on Genesis, so that already understand the character. There will be any number of traditions that are going to have evolved since then because the Bible is such a massively influential book. Nexus Gaming Studio says, are there any resources that lay out which part of the Tanakh corresponds to each source. Yes, so Richard Elliott Friedman has a book, this is about the Torah specifically, that refers, it's called The Bible with Sources Revealed, and so he makes his case why he thinks each individual component of the Torah is written either by comes from either the Yahwist source, the Elohist source, the Deuteronomist, the priestly writer, the JE redactor, and the final redactor. And so he makes the argument for that, and I find that to be a very helpful resource. What's the name of the author? Richard Elliott Friedman. The Bible with the Sources Revealed is the text. All right. So folks, we are going to do a movie review next week because I'm going to a conference and I won't be able to prepare an entire lecture. And so we've asked for movie suggestions about what we should review. Folks have said that we should review The Odyssey, the new one, which would be fun because Leandro and I haven't actually gone to the theater to see a movie in a few years. And so that would be, heard good things about it, but I would like to see it. So that's a good idea. People have said Jesus Christ Superstar. That's been at the top of our list. Monty Python's The Life of Brian. That's of course one of my favorites that I, I would love to watch it again. Always, I know a lot of it by heart. Quo Vadis, I think would be a good one. I think that I have never seen it, but Peter Ustinov is apparently chewing, the scenery. Such an incredible actor in that, and be funny. The Apple, Jesus of Montreal, The Ten Commandments. I don't know if Leandro has enough. We're trying to save some time. I don't know if we have time to watch The Ten Commandments. It's very long. We'll do it someday, but probably not next week. The Passover Plot, Exodus Decoded, and then there was a series in the 1990s called The Bible Collection that has a dozen or so films, a mini-series. So that probably also sounds like too long for next week, but I appreciate all of these suggestions. You can also keep putting them in the once this lecture ends on the outside of the YouTube, and we'll continue to look at that, and we'll announce sometime in the next week which one we watched, which one we're deciding to watch, so that you guys can watch along with us, and we'll see you next Tuesday.